Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. I am really glad to be here with you all. My name is Carol Sainthilaire. I serve on the board of My Dog is My Home, and I'm also the founder of State Impact Ventures, a New Jersey-based consulting firm where I support nonprofits and small businesses with strategy, operations, and growth. And my work has long focused on housing stability and economic justice, so this conversation really resonates with me. Today's session looks at the growing role animal welfare organizations are playing in response to the housing crisis and what it means to build capacity to meet those needs in a more intentional and integrated way. We're going to hear about an innovative model from the Massachusetts SPCA that embeds a housing policy specialist directly within animal welfare programming to help address the housing barriers before they lead to pet surrender. It's practical, cross-sector approach that offers real lessons for us all. I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Jamie Blackburn. Jamie is the housing policy specialist at the MSPCA Angel Advocacy Team. She holds a master's in public policy from Rutgers, go Jersey, and brings over 15 years of experience in the nonprofit sector with deep expertise in health and housing policy at both the state and federal levels. Before joining the MSPCA, she led technical assistance and training for the Corporation for Supportive Housing. She also brings a personal commitment to this work, having spent the last 7 years fostering dogs and helping place more than 50 rescues into homes. She lives with her family and a full house of rescue animals, three dogs, Ben, Ellie, and Bean, and two cats, Mr. Cuddles and Wednesday. So, Jamie, we're so glad you're here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Carol. I am so happy to be here. It's great to see so many folks joining this session. Really excited to talk to you all today about our work at MSPCA Angel to launch our Action for Pet Inclusive Housing, Keeping Families Together campaign. So as we just mentioned, I'm Jamie Blackburn. I'm the housing policy specialist on our advocacy team at MSPCA Angel. 15 years, I spent the last 15 years in the nonprofit sector, supporting special and vulnerable populations experiencing homelessness. For the last 7 years, as I mentioned, I was with Corporation for Supportive Housing, working with COCs and providing training and technical assistance, mostly in the intersection of healthcare and housing space. I joined MSPCA Angel in September. This is a new position that they added to our advocacy team. We have a 5-person advocacy team. With a lot of really fantastic experience, but they recognized as an animal welfare organization that they needed specific expertise in the housing space. So I was very happy to come on board and join this really fantastic team. A big part of my role, we're just getting started. It's been 6 months since I came on board, and sort of the big part in the beginning was really thinking through and designing our action steps and our big strategic plan for Action for Pet Inclusive Housing. And so I'm really happy to come and talk to you all today about what we've learned so far and where we are going with this work. So where to begin? Massachusetts is much like every other state in that we are experiencing a significant housing crisis. We're seeing this bear out across our surrender data. MSPCA is the largest animal welfare organization and shelter provider, not just in Massachusetts, but in New England. So what we do know is that a full quarter of all of our surrenders, not just in 2025, but a full quarter of all surrenders going back 3 years in the data set that I have are due to housing barriers. We know even further than that, that it's not just housing barriers generically. We can provide a lot of detail within that data set. So we know that, for example, almost 500 of those cases were due to literal homelessness. We can provide specific numbers around whether that's related to eviction or foreclosure, whether that's landlord-specific barriers that we're referring to. So we know that this has been a major issue and is driving a lot of the surrenders that we're seeing in all 5 of our locations across Massachusetts. Prior to me coming on board, we worked a little bit with a consultant to do a deeper dive into this data. I have since taken that on since coming on board, but what we've learned from that look back in our surrender data was that We actually see more cats overall than dogs that are surrendered due to housing. We see all different breeds, sizes. We have ages, so we have small kittens and puppies all the way up to older dogs. We have small, tiny dogs all the way up to large XL. And so it really spans the entire spectrum of pets in Massachusetts. So it's not just concentrated in breed specific discrimination or size specific discrimination, although we do know that that is a major component. We also found when we mapped out where the surrenders were coming from across Massachusetts that 60%, that this is a systemic issue. 60% of all zip codes in Massachusetts had at least one pet that was relinquished because of housing. And that we also found that those housing related surrenders were more likely to come from socially vulnerable parts of our state. And so areas with lower socioeconomic um, status or higher challenges. Um, we also found that when we were looking for pet inclusive housing options across the rental market, that pet inclusive housing choice was concentrated in more affluent communities. And so, of course, where we see new luxury construction, we see a lot of pet related amenities, which I think broadly speaks to the tenant and consumer demand across the rental space. But what that does in practice is create less opportunity. There are less options for people that are more economically vulnerable or in parts of the state that are more economically vulnerable. There are less choices for folks where they can bring their pets and stay safely housed. So what we found by digging into this data is that it really has disrupted and impacted our mission across the board. So obviously, starting with surrender data, we have over 1,000 cases just last year in surrender for housing related surrender. A lot of them are involuntary. Right. So a lot of unnecessary surrenders and families that are being unnecessarily pulled apart simply because of the housing market and lack of choice, overcrowding in our shelters, longer shelter stays, fewer adopters. I'm sure this is something that folks see in their locations as well. So many folks commenting and engaging with us saying, I would love to adopt, I would love to adopt. This dog or that dog, but we can't. My landlord does not allow it. Me personally, when we first adopted our very first dog, Ben, who's now 14 years old, we went to an MSPCA shelter location first. It was not part of our network then. It was Salem Northeast Shelter. Now it is part of our network. But our landlord specifically said, no specific breed bans driven by her homeowner's insurance policy. So we were unable to take home any dog that was at that shelter location that day. And we ended up going to a different shelter in New Hampshire. And we ended up finding Ben, who we love and is amazing. But it really highlights and speaks to a lot of the challenges. That we face. So fewer adopters for the dogs that are in our care. And then finally, impacts on MSPCA Angel staff. This is one that I don't think gets talked about enough, but was certainly one of the key areas that got the attention of leadership in our organization. So MSPCA Angel not only is an animal welfare organization and a shelter provider, but we also run one of the largest and most sophisticated animal hospitals in the country with a high level of capacity and all sorts of really great care options that require a lot of specialty staff. And what we have found is that it has been difficult for us to recruit and retain the staffing that we need on the hospital side, also on the shelter side, but mainly on the hospital side, especially for our Greater Boston location. Greater Boston has one of the most expensive metro areas for housing in the country. And so that was really impacting our ability to recruit and retain staff because nearly everyone that works at MSPCA has pets, and they themselves could not find housing to allow them to fill a lot of our critical positions. So all of these factors combined really drove the organization to say, okay, what can we do about this? What are some of the ways that we can find some upstream solutions to this? We already have a pretty robust community outreach team. We do a lot of engagement out in the community, but we really need to find even more further upstream solutions. So thanks to Um, Thanks to a very generous donor, the position of housing policy specialist was created to join the advocacy team, recognizing that they needed some specialized expertise around housing to try to drive our policy agenda and design some strategies to engage the housing sector and then ultimately create more options for pet inclusive housing across Massachusetts. So as you see here, this is a selection of some of the pets that were recently surrendered due to housing. This was in fall, this past fall. We've also found that high cost burden, of course, is really what's ultimately driving the housing pressures in Massachusetts. So, where we're at now is that the average cost of a one-bedroom apartment in Massachusetts is hovering anywhere from 2,400 to 3,000 a month. It starts at 3,000 in Boston for a one bedroom. You would need to make just about 100,000 a year to afford a two bedroom at fair market rate that's set by HUD. And that broadly speaking on the housing market, only 7% of those of rental units are what we would describe as pet inclusive. When we say pet friendly, it does jump to about 39%, but as we know, pet friendly just means that they could take any animal, and that includes fish or small mammals. It doesn't necessarily mean dogs and cats. And so when we talk about being pet inclusive, 7%, only 7% of the rental units, our vacancy rates for rental units in Massachusetts are also very, very low. We're talking 2%, 1% in some cases. Really, really low. So such a tight and competitive and expensive housing market. Uh, We also know, I get a lot of questions when talking about housing internally to our teams and to other folks about how we got here. Why is the housing market so difficult to navigate and so complex? And how did we end up in such a situation where it's this critical? And so what I like to sort of give a snapshot explanation to folks is that it's intentionally complex. The systems that finance housing development, particularly affordable housing development in the United States, are um, they're complex. There's many different funding streams that are only just now they're trying to untangle or try to streamline funding streams to make it easier for developers and for projects to get up off the ground. Um, but for the most part, they're burdensome, they're administratively burdensome, they're complex. It relies on our capitalistic market system and a multi-step process and teams with developers. Navigating local zoning is always a major barrier to the creation of housing unless you live in a state where they have created a mechanism to work around local opposition. That can be really, really a huge barrier. And then finally, legacy of systemic discrimination, racial discrimination that goes back decades, chronic disinvestment in particular neighborhoods. And it's baked in to the systems. And so now over time, we find ourselves now in 2026 with a housing market that is highly polarized. It does not meet the needs. We see massive amounts of economic and income inequality, and that spills over into health outcomes, and then on and on and on, all driven by this legacy of systemic discrimination in housing. And so that's really where what leads us here. And so therefore we have to design solutions to try to punch through the difficulties in the housing market that we have found and that we are currently living with. So in response to all of these pressures in the housing market in Massachusetts, we've launched in October of 2025, we launched Action for Pet Inclusive Housing, keeping families together as a way to engage the housing sector. But it is a comprehensive campaign that includes partnership development, policy advocacy, and then also internal support and development across um, our locations, our teams, our staff at MSPCA. And we're really focused on those upstream solutions because our sort of our theory of change is that through those key partnerships, policy change, and then those resources and referrals are ultimately going to work together over time to generate more pet inclusive housing units statewide and therefore less involuntary surrenders. We are pretty lucky in that we do have a good handle on our data. So we are going to be able to track, and of course, we are tracking housing related surrenders over time to see for trends, to see how. So we're really going to be closely monitoring that. For the rest of this year, of course, and then in the next 2 years, this campaign has been funded for 3 years through donor support to see by the end of it how much impact we'll be able to hopefully measure the impact on surrenders and other variables. So, what are some of the basic best practices around housing advocacy and support that folks can do? We recognize this is highly unusual, as folks keep telling me. I don't come from the animal welfare space specifically. I have volunteered locally for many years as a foster family for local rescues, but primarily my expertise is in housing and human services, and so I get a lot of questions on what are some of the basic things that we can do to get started when they perhaps are not in an organization that has the same level of donor support that MSPCA Angel has been really fortunate enough to receive to make this a reality. We had one really dedicated donor who understands the power of advocacy that made this happen, but we certainly recognize that that's unusual in a lot of cases. And so I thought we could walk through these one by one. This is also going to be in the form of a handout. So it's a PDF attachment to this session that summarizes some of these basic things that don't require a lot, if any, new resources or funding. It really is just some staff time that might need to be allocated to be able to do some of these basic steps that can really help guide some action steps around engaging the housing sector and addressing the need for pet inclusive housing. Starting number one with data collection, identifying trends in that data, collecting stories on the impact of housing on pets and families, identifying potential community partners and maybe local or state level resources, depending on where you are. Staying informed as an animal welfare organization on state and local tenancy rights and eviction processes. That's a huge one. I've been part of my role is triaging phone calls and requests for information from the community, either through our community outreach or folks that come in through the shelter or perhaps through MSP, the hospital. We have a variety of methods that folks get connected to me. But I get a lot of questions about eviction prevention. What are my rights? I have maybe someone has a pet, maybe they have an unauthorized or an authorized pet, maybe there's a landlord dispute. I get a lot of questions about that, and having a basic understanding of what the law says in your local area around eviction process is so important. It's so important. Massachusetts is a state that has strong tenancy protection laws. The burden is more on the landlord's side if they wish to pursue eviction. And that makes a huge difference when these cases come up. And so, what does your local, state, and local, perhaps your city, what does the law say? What is the process? There are a lot of resources that you can dig in to inform yourself on that so that you can provide the right kind of advice or perhaps refer folks to those legal aid resources in your area to better answer those questions. And then finally, staying informed, conducting basic local housing market research. Do you know what the vacancy rate is? Do you know what the average cost of rent? Do you know what percentage of pet inclusive or pet friendly units are in your area? Do you have a sense of what your housing market looks like? And are you staying informed? So we're going to dig into these one by one. So collecting the right data. This is always step one. There is no way that we could have advanced this campaign. No way that we could have established the housing policy specialist position or solicited the donor support necessary to make that position possible without having the right data to tell the story. So what is the surrender process and what questions are being asked during the surrender process? So I've provided up here the codes that we use in our data system. We use Chameleon for our vet services. And so, what codes are we using when we're doing an intake for surrender at the shelter? Are we using to try to track this? And so, we use codes around eviction, foreclosure, homelessness, insurance, landlord breed restrictions, landlord no pet, so just no pets allowed at all, landlord size, and then moving categories. And these were not always the original categories we have. Some of these were new that I had suggested as a way to really make sure that our data is as accurate as possible. So it really, we took a moment to sit and say, okay, what is the data telling us? Where is there room for improvement? One of the things I noticed with our data collection is a lot of our folks were moving really quickly and they were simply labeling everything as moving. But then when we would dig into the notes on that case rather than just the data label, it actually, the notes betrayed to us that, ooh, actually, it's not moving. This person really, this case really should be put under landlord no pet because yes, they're moving, but they're moving to a house or a new housing that does not, the landlord does not allow pets, and that's really the reason. So we need to make sure that this is labeled appropriately in our system so that we're really tracking the outcomes to the best of our ability. Same thing with homelessness. There was some education that needed to be done internally around what are the HUD define, what are the definitions of homelessness and how can we be in alignment with those definitions of homelessness that are used to distribute resources through a homelessness continuum of care? How can we be in alignment with those HUD definitions as much as possible and make sure everyone has the same understanding so that we're getting our data right? Um, and yeah, and better for systems alignment. So that would be my, step one is taking a look at the surrender process, at what questions are being asked, and are we developing a data set that's going to tell this story over time? And then analyzing, sitting with that data. That was the first thing I did was get my hands on 3 years worth of surrender data to really examine the trends. And that's really going to tell the story to you about and point you in the right direction as for your next steps, which is what are the resources and who are my community partners to help me address this? We found that landlord restrictions, that landlord simply not allowing pets at all, were the number one reason for housing related surrenders, followed by literal homelessness. We do have some cases, for example, of eviction and foreclosure, but they're very small. So that was less of an issue and less of a driver amongst the data set. What are the characteristics of the animals that are being surrendered? Are you finding that there are more breed specific surrenders or are you finding something else? For us, we found it was all over the place. It was not necessarily breed specific. Our hypothesis, of course, was that it's going to be larger sized, maybe blocky headed dogs that are being surrendered, but that wasn't the case. It was all over the map for us. We also found that more cats were being surrendered versus dogs, which was an interesting find as well, and just speaks to the overall lack of housing choice across the market, even for cats. And then finally, what improvements to our data collection and training can we make? And so as I mentioned, we improved some of our categories, we updated descriptions of those labels, and then provided some fresh training for our staff on the impact of housing and the process and why we're collecting this data, why it's important to get it right, and what we're using it for in terms of our advocacy. And then so once we got our hands on the data, we really understood what we were doing and what story was being told. That then allows us to point to the existing resources and connecting folks to those resources based on need. So some of the practical steps that we did was updating links on our website, mspca.org/housing, links to shelter, um, uh, domestic violence resources, eviction prevention. Massachusetts has some very great eviction prevention resources through our rental assistance for families in transition program funded through the state, legal aid resources, and then most importantly, affordable housing search. So Massachusetts I'm going to talk about this a little bit more at the end of this presentation, but Massachusetts has this really fantastic organization and website called Housing Navigator, and we linked that search engine to our site, our housing page. And as it comes to turn out, as soon as that was the very first thing that we did, because we get a lot of traffic to our website about people looking for resources for pet inclusive housing. And so we put up housingnavigator.org on there. And then they reached out to us later to say, hey, did you know that MSPCA was the largest driver of traffic to our website in October? We'd love to talk to you. And so that's what triggered the first conversations between us and Housing Navigator, which I'm going to get into in just a sec about the benefits of that partnership. And then finally, new community outreach clinics. So we do have a community outreach department. They do a lot of just amazing, amazing work across Massachusetts. They partner with public housing authorities. They do community vaccine clinics. They do pet food pantries. And we started looking for opportunities to expand those clinics in areas of need, and as a way to advance some of our strategic partnerships. So we recently completed a new community outreach clinic for a subsidized affordable housing project on the North Shore of Massachusetts. The company that owns that building and manages that building is one of the largest housing providers in the state. They have over 16,000 units in their portfolio. And so using that as a way to build bridges between the housing sector and animal welfare to say, we want to be a good community partner as we're advocating and trying to push for more pet inclusive housing, pet inclusive policies within housing, and sort of using this as a way to build those bridges. Establishing new partnerships. So the data is going to tell you what partnerships you might need. If homelessness, literal homelessness, is a huge driver in your community, you're going to want to get really familiar and comfortable with your homelessness continuum of care, known as the COC. That is the homeless response system in your local area. Domestic violence advocates. MSPCA Angel doesn't have a large number of domestic violence related surrenders, but there was enough to warrant deeper connections. There is not a single domestic violence shelter in the state of Massachusetts that accepts companion animals. And so opening a dialogue around that space and sharing our data with them around what we're seeing. Affordable housing providers. Who are the big affordable housing providers in your community? Do they have any sites that are pet friendly? Are they opening up new lotteries anytime soon? Every state manages that a little bit differently. As I mentioned, in Massachusetts, we have Housing Navigator, and if you're an affordable housing provider, any units that are coming through a project, that needs to be listed on the site. It's required if you take any state financing that you have to enter that information into the site, and so that way you can find where those affordable housing lotteries are and when wait lists are opening and that sort of thing. But not every state has a centralized system that way, and sometimes you need to build those individual partnerships to find out where those are. Big property management companies that manage thousands of units. If it's simply a straight up, we just don't have enough market rate housing across the board. Who are the largest companies in your area that have the biggest portfolios, and what sort of outreach can you do with them to open up a dialogue? Public housing authorities. We chose in that avenue, we have 287 separate public housing authorities in Massachusetts. And so engaging individually is quite difficult. So we engage with Boston Public Housing because they are the largest. But otherwise, we opted to take a public policy change route for that. And we've actually had some big success. And then finally, community action agencies. Community action agencies receive federal funding, and they often, in a lot of communities, distribute rental assistance and other housing programs. They sometimes are also housing developers in a lot of places. And so building partnerships with them so that you can start to advocate for pet inclusive policies before projects even break ground in your community. So collecting the data, making sure that your data collection processes are on point so that you can really understand, how many of our surrenders are being driven. by housing related pressures, and then using that data to tell you and point the way for which type of partnerships you might want to just focus on. And if you're really resource limited, you might want to just narrow in on what's the most important for now and then grow from there. And then the other step that I mentioned is supporting clients and staff. So we're doing a lot of externally facing outreach and policy advocacy, of course, but what are we doing internally for our clients and our teams? So part of my role is triaging housing related needs, making referrals. A lot of our staff themselves, as I mentioned, they need help finding pet inclusive housing. So when I find a a new building that's opening, or if I find something that looks really good, I will make that available to folks. I will triage and serve as a resource for staff if they are encountering issues with their landlord, if they want to know what resources are available through the state programs. What they might be eligible for, what maybe it's not for themselves, maybe it's for people that they know, and or it could be for folks that we're serving through our community outreach programs or within the hospital, just serving as a one-stop shop for all things housing. Um, and it really runs the gambit. It can be for staff, it could be for patients. Sometimes we get just concerned calls from the community, from folks who want to support unhoused people that are accompanied by pets and they don't know where to turn or what to do. And so how are we making sure that those calls that we're getting into our call center are being addressed, and the resources are being connected? Um, I've gone ahead and created some internal resources to help with this. So as I mentioned before, this is an example of one of the resources I've created internally to be used across all 5 of our shelter locations. Um, it's customized to reflect the Massachusetts situation, what our law says around eviction process. As I mentioned before, that's the number one reason that people call to ask about housing. They're saying, I'm being evicted. I'm going to have to surrender today because my landlord is threatening me with eviction. And so this was our response to provide some basic information to folks, because obviously our folks at our shelter staff are not housing navigators, they're not housing specialists, but we do want to be able to provide factual resources to folks. And so um, I created this resource in response to the number one question, which is, my landlord is telling me I have 3 days to get rid of my dogs, or a week to get rid of my dogs, or I'm going to be evicted. And so this really takes you through the 4 basic things that landlords need to do in Massachusetts before they can even evict you. Reaffirming that a verbal threat of eviction is not legally enforceable. For example, they have to give you written 30-day notice. There is a process that they must follow. And this information comes right from our mass.gov resources and legal aid, but it's just been filtered down and condensed to make it as accessible as possible. I added links on there. So the QR codes will take you to the big guide that, for example, Greater Boston Legal Services has on their self-help tool for eviction. And then the other QR code takes you to the Massachusetts Housing Help Hub, which is where you can apply for rental assistance and eviction prevention resources, and other things that we have. And so this is a way for us to help folks think through their options. Just because your landlord says that you have to get rid of your dogs today or you're going to be evicted, if they have not followed the legal process, for instance, then you do not have to surrender today. You can fight this eviction if you choose to do so in order to stay with your pet. And so really finding those options for people who feel that who really want to avoid surrendering their pet, and giving them those options if they're willing to take them. Another resource we created was just a basic one-pager for folks that are experiencing homelessness. As I mentioned, we had almost 500 cases of people who had to surrender due to literal homelessness last year. And so I created just a basic fact sheet of where the individual shelters are based on all 5 of our individual shelter, animal shelter locations. If they have a specific coordinated entry contact, that's the coordinated entry is the front door for the homeless system in every community, and where folks are triaged and then referred for resources and placement for housing. And then on the right-hand side for this sheet, the QR code will take you. Massachusetts has a centralized system for family shelter. And so there's this one centralized front door for that statewide that families call and they receive triage. And so this will link to that as well. One of the bigger steps that we're taking, that we're hoping to take within the family shelter, is to get a question added through that centralized triage process about pets. Right now, there's not a single family shelter in Massachusetts that will accept companion animals, but to our knowledge, they're not even asking um, families questions when they're presenting for triage at the front door for that system if they're pet accompanied. So essentially, in Massachusetts, if you want to access your constitutional right to shelter as a family with children, you're essentially required to surrender your pets. So we're hoping to advance some solutions on that too by starting with collecting the right data as to how many families are presenting at the front door of this system that are pet accompanied, so that we can start to think about solutions to address that. So these are just some basic resources that I've created internally to support our shelter staff, and the folks that are presenting, to see how we can avoid surrender wherever possible. And then finally, one of the other basic things that we've done, which I'm really excited about, is I mentioned we're working with Housing Navigator. So after we put Housing Navigator, we linked Housing Navigator on our website. That triggered our initial conversation and then ultimately a partnership. Housing Navigator is in the process of updating their search functions for us at our request, and those should be going live probably by early summer. Right now, you can filter pet-friendly housing, but as we know, pet-friendly could mean hamsters, does not mean cats and dogs. So we have proposed that they add additional categories so that prospective tenants do not have to navigate as many barriers to connect with that housing. A lot of the listings on Housing Navigator right now will say call for more information, call for the specific pet policy. And we want to make sure that that tenants do not have to jump through all those extra hoops, and that they can actually filter, allows dogs, no restrictions, allows cats. We actually have proposed a couple of new categories. The double bonus for this is that because Housing Navigator is basically the clearinghouse for all state financed affordable or income restricted housing in the state, it's required for property managers to enter their unit information and property information by requiring them to enter their pet policies in greater detail. We have the added bonus of being able to track the creation of pet inclusive units over time once that change goes into effect, because their data set is essentially the entire count of all income restricted units in the state. So once we have these updated categories, we'll be able to track the creation of units over time. One of our biggest goals for Action for Pet Inclusive Housing tracks along with the statewide housing production plan for Massachusetts, which is to create 220,000 new units by 2035. And we are hoping to step into the conversation as much as possible in order to promote and ensure that some of those 220,000 units will be pet inclusive. And we'll be able to count that using the data from Housing Navigator once this goes into effect. So I'm particularly excited about this part of the campaign. And so on your end, if you do not have a Housing Navigator, some of the or equivalents, some of the basic things that you can ask are, how quickly can you find rental options that allow pets? Are the policies available? Do you have to call? Is there a cost difference between pet inclusive or no pet options? And another huge question is your rental market more corporate owned or smaller holding landlords? And we ask because so far we found that it has been more impactful to engage with those larger corporate, large, portfolio holders that manage thousands of units, rather than individual smaller holding landlords. So at scale, we seem to have more success in engaging, pet policy conversations, for larger portfolio holders, but everybody's individual housing market looks a little different, and so your strategies will have to adapt. So finally, our policy agenda. So in addition to our practical, data collection, analysis, our community partnerships, our support, we have a pretty robust policy advocacy agenda, of which we're very happy to say we've had some recent success. And so it was just last week. The Massachusetts Senate passed the Pets Act, which has quite a few things in it related to some of our bigger advocacy items relating to the sale of puppy mills and preventing puppy mills in Massachusetts. But related to housing in particular, we had a couple of really big wins, which we're very excited about. So as I mentioned, we have 287 separate public housing authorities in Massachusetts with 287 different pet policies. The only folks residents of public housing up until now that were guaranteed the right to have a pet were those living in elderly housing. So with the passage of this, once it goes to the governor's desk, this will expand that program of pet ownership for all residents of public housing, not just elderly public housing, but for families as well. It also limits pet deposits and prevents PHAs from discriminating on dog breed, size, and weight. And then finally, the biggest win is that this piece of legislation will prohibit insurance companies from underwriting or having policies that discriminate on the basis of breed, which is a major win that we are really, really excited about. And I'm sure everyone knows is the most cited reason when we talk to property management companies and landlords as to why they do not have a more pet inclusive policy. So we are really confident that this is going to supercharge the creation of more pet inclusive housing and pave the way for really new and more productive partnerships with the housing sector now that this is going to go into effect. We're very confident that it will be heading to the governor's desk for signature. And you can see actually on that image on the right-hand side of the slide, the dog right in the middle is mine. That's Ellie. That's my one of my three rescue dogs. Great. So some final takeaways that I want folks to have before we get into the questions is that, housing is complex. As I mentioned, there's so many competing streams and programs, and there's so many stakeholders, but your response to it doesn't have to be, as an animal welfare organization, starting with your data, and then let that drive your next steps, right? If you take a look at your data and you see, wow, there's actually quite a lot of folks that are experiencing homelessness in my community and having to surrender, but maybe you're not connected to your continuum of care, perhaps, and that would be the best place to start. If you are seeing more, like we did, which is landlord no pet, so just no pets allowed, housing in general, engaging with market rate housing providers, large portfolio housing providers might be your first step. Ultimately, every community has active stakeholders around housing. Every community does. You have to end homelessness. So you just have to plug in and show up to those conversations. It doesn't have to be a big formal campaign. You can start small as you need to, and just take one step at a time, and let your data tell you what those steps need to be. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing because I know we had some really great questions, and I am excited
Yes.
to dig into them.
The chat has been popping. I am just so fascinated by everything happening in Massachusetts. When Jamie and I touched base in for preparation for today, it's like, oh my gosh, this is like the dream job as someone who, really rescues animals and her professional experiences in housing. So, Jamie, thank you so much for sharing all of this amazing information and resources, and hopefully more states across the country will implement these sorts of policies. So we have a few questions. I'm going to go based on the number of votes they had. So I'm really interested in how this model could be adapted in communities that don't have strong existing cross-sector infrastructure. What were the biggest barriers when integrating housing support into an animal welfare organization, and what made it sustainable long-term?
Yeah, that's a really great question. What's interesting is that there's so much in Massachusetts is kind of a weird it's a little odd because we do have a lot of really good cross-sector collaboration, especially between health and housing for human services, but there is very little to any cross-sector collaboration between animal welfare and housing. So we know how to do it when it comes to cross-sector collaboration, especially on the housing side. The housing folks know, but animal welfare has never. This is a first, and so. I would say, big shout out to our advocacy team who really made this happen. Kara Holmquist, who's our director of advocacy at MSPCA, she's been there for 30 years. She really recognized that this was something that needed to happen, and she really made those resources materialize to make this happen. And so the barriers we didn't have as many barriers as you would think because the data was really speaking for itself. But I think it's hard to get folks that just, silos are deep and getting people to think differently. Even in just basic conversation, I find myself now having to say human shelter and animal shelter because in the past I'd just say shelter and I'm talking about homeless response work, but not in not in animal welfare. And so I've had to be very specific with the language. Um, so I think much like with health and housing integration for humans, it's trying to speak the same language, making sure that we, ultimately identifying those shared priorities, right? We want to keep people and pets together. We want people to thrive. We want people to have access to their basic things that they need. Um, and so I think that you don't have to have existing strong cross-sector collaboration because we're building the plane as we're flying it here. Animal welfare is not used to doing this, but we're reaching out and I am finding that there are animal advocates in every corner and animal champions in every space that I am reaching out to. I am finding someone who's interested and a natural champion, an organic champion within that organization or in that sector that I want to reach out to and just start a dialogue. And so I would say there's probably less barriers than you think, and just start the conversation um, and find those shared priorities. Those shared priorities are what make it sustainable. It's not necessarily the financial resources, if that's what the question is getting to, in my opinion. It
Yeah,
really is,
and I would
yeah, shared
say
priorities.
from my lived experience and professional experience trying to navigate those two worlds, it's sort of, getting rid of biases on both sides, getting the human providers to get rid of biases about animals or breed, then getting the animal advocates, the pet advocates to get rid of some of the biases around income or, oh, they're in public housing. If they can barely, if they need to go to a food bank for themselves, they have no business adopting an animal. And I am sometimes in these conversations just like, we're working against each other here. Like, we want the same thing. We know the benefits of the human animal bond. And, it's, we have the same priorities. We just have to learn how to speak a little bit better to each other, to understand each other.
Absolutely.
How does having a housing specialist inside an animal welfare organization actually change outcomes for families? Are you seeing fewer people forced to give up their pets?
So I love this question. And so I think the short answer is not yet, because we've only had this campaign up and running since October, and we've built this comprehensive data set that looks back 3 years. But since the campaign has really only started to gain steam, like I said, we just passed our legislation, just passed the Senate. Once that goes into effect and is signed by the governor, once those changes are implemented, say on Housing Navigator, for instance, and we can really track the number of units that are pet inclusive versus pet friendly and have a comprehensive data set, at least on the subsidized housing side, um, then we're really going to be able to really track long term those outcomes and that impact. It's my goal to at the 1 year mark, we're going to be checking in and we're going to be seeing has our in reach across all of our 5 shelters and the resources that we've created, the extra trainings around housing, having me on board as a resource to triage these cases and help and be a resource for folks. We are hoping that and anticipating that yes, we will be able to quantify and demonstrate long term. As I mentioned before, this campaign's been funded for 3 years. And so at the end of the 3 year period, absolutely, we are hoping to be able to see a measurable outcome where we can see we'll be seeing fewer surrenders. And then we have a few different data points that we'll be able to lean on to try to see, have we had how many pet inclusive units have we added over time through our advocacy? Yeah, and how many fewer surrenders have we seen related to housing over time? And those are 2 numbers that we're going to be paying very close attention to.
Um, do you have any recommendations or specific strategies for more rural communities that don't have lots of new housing opportunity to advocate for pet inclusivity?
Yeah. So I would say, going back to the partnerships piece, so our strategy in Massachusetts has been, yes, we want to influence some of the new housing production, right? That 220,000 new units by 2035. Yes, we're at the table. We want to have influence over those conversations. But we're also having active conversations with existing property management companies for their current portfolios to say, have you considered your policies? We've created resources for that corporate outreach to say, hey, did you know it's actually a really good return on investment? Hey, did you know that tenants and consumers want pet amenities? They want pet inclusive housing. There's a lot of really good market research. Sometimes just having those conversations. Who are the largest housing providers in your area? We found, for example, through our market research, just that basic market research that I've been doing, for example, that anyone can do in their community, we discovered that one of the larger corporate housing providers in our area was actually advertising that they were donating $5 of every tenant's pet rent to the MSPCA. We had no idea. And then we used that conversation to say, hey, we really would love to partner with you. And that opened up more conversations and more doors. And suddenly you're finding that there's natural, organic animal advocates in these companies that love their pets and want to be supportive. And now you've got a dialogue going. And that had nothing to do with creating new housing, which may not be happening in your community. They might not be building. So then you're going to want to focus on who are the existing folks. I would say even rural communities have advocacy coalitions, right? Who are they? Are you plugged into them? Do you know who they are and who those stakeholders are? Have you had a conversation with all of them to see where you might be able to naturally plug in? Sometimes it feels like there isn't a lot going on, but actually there is because we didn't dig deep enough to find it. And so if you're in those areas, that's what I would recommend. Who are the large housing providers? Can you engage them? Can you find natural allies within them? And can you link up with the existing advocacy, even if it's not for if there's nothing in your local community, what's at the state level that you can plug into?
Thank you. Does the Pets Act change include homeowners insurance policies? So maybe for
It
like these smaller landlords.
it does. It covers rental and homeowners insurance. In fact, we actually we had it was supposed to include both in the original language, and then when the final bill language came out, it didn't actually have rental. It just said homeowners, and then they had to go back and fix it by amendment because that was a sort of a technical error from our sponsor's office, but it sent us all into a panic for a minute. But it has both, so we're very happy about that.
Let's see. What I feel like you kind of touched on this. What strategies have you found most effective when working with landlords and property management on advocating for pet inclusivity?
So we started larger rather than smaller, as I mentioned. A lot of the original opposition, we haven't had a ton of opposition, but the opposition that has popped up has almost always exclusively centered around, or not even opposition, but just like concerns that may have come up in the dialogue, especially when we were talking policy change. People had fears as sort of small holding landlords. We have a lot of triple deckers in Massachusetts, so 3 units, single building, 3 units, very common. And those are owned by smaller holding folks. Typically they might be they might live in one of the units and then they rent out the other two. And there were a lot of concerns about that. And so we were able to say, you know what, right now, our campaign is really focused on large corporate housing providers with large portfolios. We are not zooming in on small holding landlords at this time, and that really smoothed the way for these conversations for people to go, oh, okay, right, all right. And on the bright side for that, it's actually the smarter approach in terms of impact at scale, right? Rather than, having individual, eventually we're going to get to individual one-on-one conversations with landlords, especially once the legislation becomes law, and affects that insurance, because that's usually the number one thing that small holding landlords will say is the barrier is the insurance. The corporate folks have all over the map with their reasons for why, not just insurance. Um, and so I would say that would be the primary.
On the other side of things, can you talk about adoption and what is required for adoption to ensure that they don't become surrenders? Do adopters have to prove that they can have an animal where they live?
I do believe that they're asked about their living situation during the adoption process, but don't quote me because I'm not as familiar with MSPCA's like every question on our adoption through our adoption process. But I do believe they ask, but again, you mentioned attitudes before, Carol, on animal welfare side, and I know that we certainly don't believe at MSPCA Angel that, you know, that idea that like, if you can't afford this or that you don't deserve to have a pet or that we don't, that's not the ethos that we practice.
Which is so
So
amazing for such a large animal welfare agency
yeah,
to
we
be low
really
barrier. Yeah.
very low barrier. Yep. And we make sure, our community outreach efforts and are robust to make sure that folks, are able to support their pets if they want to have pets and that everyone can have what they need.
Who were your partners for getting the Pets Act, through all the bodies of government and, to almost at the governor's table?
So our two biggest partners were the Animal Rescue League of Boston and then Humane World for Animals. And so those are our two best friends and big, our allies here in Massachusetts around policy. And also I think, MSPCA Angel is a really, I think we are the oldest animal welfare organization in the country. And we have a long, long history, especially in Massachusetts. And so, like I mentioned, our director of advocacy here, Kara, she's been here for 30 years, has overseen so many positive policy change on behalf of animals. And so those longstanding relationships also really, really helped smooth the way for this success.
And last question, what advice can you give to animal welfare agencies about replicating this model and having a housing specialist like you, a housing policy expert, as part of their team to kind of serve as that liaison between the human world and the animal world? Because I know I want to know because you have my dream job.
I would say most folks aren't going to be able to add. And that's what people have said a lot is that most organizations are just not going to be able to add this specific type of position. And so I would say, in lieu of being able to create an entirely new position, if you have someone in-house that feels very passionate about housing, to do some of those basic steps, can you dedicate some staff time from that individual who has that natural passion and inclination to either, if they don't already know about housing, to at least learn about the housing sector, and then be the point person to reach out to those housing agencies and plug into that network of housing folks in your community so that you can almost tag team it and take a hybrid approach, right? You don't have to necessarily be a fully trained housing navigator that knows all the ins and outs of everything, but you can reach out and form a partnership with your community action agency that has housing navigation services, or the COC, or one of the organizations within the COC, especially if that is a housing provider that allows pets. They're probably going to be very eager to want to partner with you as an animal welfare organization and see how you can where's that common space where you can support each other and then lean on their expertise to try to advance some of your housing work and build up your knowledge of the housing sector so that you can come up with a plan based on what your goals are. And they'll be able to help you, and then you'll be able to help them as well. I know that for example, when we first reached out to the corporate housing provider that we just did our most recent clinic, they have a huge portfolio of subsidized and market rate housing, and we plugged in right with their property management folks for the North Shore, and they were so eager to talk to us just to be able to have some experts, if you will, on call to be able to say, I have this challenge with the pet and a tenant, and we really want to support them. We really want to avoid eviction, but we don't really know how to handle this behavioral situation, or we don't know how to handle. And they were so eager to just to have someone that they could call for that expertise. And then vice versa. We, of course, are eager to form new partnerships with the largest housing provider in the state, and ultimately further these bigger conversations around pet policies so that we're basically saying we want to show up to the table as a good community partner to you. Will you be willing to show up
Yeah.
to the partner for us to
Yeah.
have this dialogue about just a dialogue about pet policies, right? And that's where it
Yeah.
starts. That's where it starts.
Well, I know we are at time, but Jamie, thank you so much. You have been an inspiration, and I cannot wait for the Pets Act to get signed in Massachusetts. And I hope that we can have something like that in New Jersey and in every state across the country. We will be following along. Thank you, everyone, for your questions and your engagement in the chat. And I hope you continue to enjoy the rest of the My Dog is My Home conference. Take care, everybody.
All right. Thank you guys so much.
Chasing